If you visit the Noto Peninsula or stand on the banks of the Tone River, you are standing in what most consider the traditional heart of Japan. But if you ask a linguist what Noto actually means in Japanese, you will likely get a shrug. There is no clear root. It is a ghost in the language. Now, imagine someone tells you that the very name of Mount Fuji, the ultimate symbol of the nation, doesn't belong to the Japanese language as we know it today. Instead, these names are echoes of a people we've been told belong strictly to the snowy wilds of Hokkaido. The Ainu. We have this fixed image in our minds. We see the Ainu as the indigenous people of the north, perhaps even migrants who trickled down from the freezing Kuril Islands or Sakhalin to settle the frontier. It's a neat, comfortable narrative that draws a clear line between them and us. But then you look at the Haniwa statues excavated in Gunma terracotta figures with large eyes and square jawlines that look nothing like the delicate features found in the Kinki region. You start to hear the old stories of the Mojin, the hairy people of central Japan, and the lost Hitakami kingdom of the northeast. Suddenly, the map flips. The narrative we've accepted, that the Ainu are a separate northern entity, begins to crumble. What if the people we call Ainu didn't come from the north at all? What if they were the original heartbeat of Honshu, driven toward the edges of the map by the tides of war in the 12th century? To understand the Ainu is to realize that the true history of Japan isn't a story of two different peoples, but a story of a single ancient Jomon identity that was fractured, migrated, and eventually misunderstood by the very people who descended from it. So that sets up, an archaeological, historical, and linguistic mystery of pretty epic proportions. Our mission today is to really follow that thread. We're going to dive into the Ainu language itself, the Ainu-itak, to see if its structure, its grammar, and its traditions can confirm this huge revised view.
Exactly. This idea that the Ainu are not just survivors from the north, but they're, linguistic relics of a Jomon identity that once spanned the whole archipelago.
And to really get that, you first have to understand just how fundamentally different Ainu is from the Japanese that we all know.
That's right. And what's so fascinating is that this search for Ainu origins, the historical movement, sometimes described as the emishi migrating from Honshu's Hitakami kingdom after those wars in the 12th century, that whole story is mirrored by the complexity we find inside the language.
So the language itself holds clues to their history.
It suggests a really high degree of linguistic stability. It had to be strong to survive centuries of contact. So I think we have to start by understanding how the Ainu define themselves, how they organize their world through their language, before we can even start to trace their footprints across ancient Honshu.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We should start with the identity marker itself, the word Ainu. Where does that come from?
Right, so the term, and the pronunciation is closer to Ainu, is what linguists call an endonym. It's a name a group uses for itself.
And what does it actually mean?
Well, on the surface, its literal meaning is just person, or man in general, human being.
That sounds pretty neutral.
It does, but here's the critical part. It serves a very strong contractive function. It's all about defining the Ainu in opposition to non-Ainu groups.
So an us versus them kind of thing.
Precisely. Most notably against the Japanese, who they historically called Shizon. So the contrast creates this boundary. It's not just we are people, it's we are the human beings in contrast to them.
That's a really powerful cultural self-definition baked right into the name.
Absolutely. And it extends. The language itself is Ainu-itak, which means Ainu voice or tongue. And their land is Ainu-moshir, Ainu land.
I see.
They even have these collective terms for themselves within the community, like utar for people, or the affiliative form utari.
And utari means what exactly?
It's more like relatives, or I think more pointedly, our Ainu people. So this whole array of terms, it just speaks to this really nuanced internal sense of kinship, and at the same time, this external distinction.
And you mentioned there's a notable exception with some of the more geographically separated groups.
Yes, the Sakhalin Ainu. They historically kept a linguistic distance even from their cousins in Hokkaido. They used a totally distinct term, inshi, to identify themselves.
That's fascinating. Just that one word tells you a lot.
It tells you that even within what we call the Ainu-speaking world, centuries, maybe millennia of separation and different cultural paths, created these very real, measurable linguistic boundaries.
Okay, so let's get into the deep mechanics now, the typology. We said Ainu is fundamentally different from Japanese. If Japanese is famous for, its particles and its appendant marking, what's the architectural principle of Ainu?
Ainu is typologically distinct because it's what we call a head marking language.
Okay, head marking. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So Japanese, as you said, is dependent marking. This means if you have a noun phrase, the markers, like the case particles ga, onale, they attach to the noun. The noun is the dependent element, and those particles show its relationship to the main verb, which is the head of the sentence.
Right, so the noun is sort of carrying the relational baggage, so to speak.
Precisely. In Ainu, it's the complete opposite. The dependency relations are marked directly on the head of the phrase. So in a verb phrase, the verb itself, the action word, is what takes all the agreement markers, any incorporated nouns, and the pronominal affixes.
So all the relational information is packed right onto the verb.
Exactly. If I'm the subject of a sentence, the verb changes to acknowledge me, rather than me adding a particle to myself. It's a much more compact structure, and that seems to be vital to its stability over time.
And that leads into its other big feature, right? Polysynthesis.
It does. This head marking trait is really the engine for Ainu's other major characteristic. It is polysynthetic. And that's just a fancy word for its ability to fuse many, many morphemes, so prefixes, suffixes, incorporated nouns, into a single, incredibly complex verb structure.
And it's not just a jumble of parts. You said it's highly ordered.
Very highly ordered.
Okay, so could you walk us through what a complex Ainu verb might look like, maybe in translation?
Let's try. Imagine an English phrase like, we habitually fetch food for her from the river. In English, that's 9 separate words, a couple prepositions.
Right.
In a highly polysynthetic language like Ainu, you would take the root verb, let's say fetch, and you'd start fusing all that relational and circumstantial information directly onto it.
So you'd start with the verb stem?
Right, the core. And as you move outwards from that core, you add things. You might add the incorporated noun food, which changes the verb's argument structure. Then you could add a prefix, like ko or e, to bring in the beneficiary, the for her part. And then finally, on the very edge, you might stick a plural or habitual suffix or a personal prefix to show the agent, the we.
So you end up with one massive word that is basically an entire clause.
That's it. And what the complex verbal forms show is that as you move away from that central verb stem towards the periphery, the meaning you're expressing becomes progressively more subjective or spatial or interpersonal. It's this incredibly information-dense, highly efficient linguistic machine. It's nothing like the looser structure of Japanese.
Wow. Okay, let's pivot to nouns then, because Ainu has this really crucial cultural and linguistic distinction about ownership that tells us a lot about their worldview, the inalienability distinction.
This is a fundamental grammatical division, and it really reflects their cultural understanding of the world. So you have inalienable possession. This applies to things that just can't logically be transferred or separated from the possessor.
Like body parts.
Body parts are the classic example. Tek for hand, kikin for skin, sapa for head. But also some kinship terms and relational terms, like sam for beside.
And the crucial point here, I think, is that these nouns are obligatorily possessed. You can't just say them on their own.
Exactly. You cannot just utter the word for hand in its bare dictionary form in a sentence. It wouldn't make sense. You have to use a personal prefix plus what's called an affiliative suffix on the noun. So kuteki is my hand. Iteki is your hand. The possessive relationship is structurally required by the grammar.
That makes perfect sense for a body part. But what are the other category? Alienable possession.
Alienable possession is for all the transferable items. Things you can own and give away, a dog, a tool, a boat. And since these items are conceptually separable from you, they can't use that tight prefix and suffix structure.
So they need a whole different construction.
A completely different relative clause-based construction that uses the verb core, which means have.
Can you give us a specific example of that contrast?
Sure. So to say my dog, you would say kukor seta. And that literally translates to the dog I have.
I see.
Or my house would be kukor chis. You have to use that longer relative construction because the house or the dog is something that can be transferred or traded or sold. So the grammatical system itself is constantly enforcing this cultural distinction about what is part of the self and what is just external property.
And that level of structural categorization, that extends to location as well, doesn't it?
It does. Ainu grammatically distinguishes between locations and non-locations, even when they're functioning as direct arguments of verbs. So ordinary nouns in their basic form, they generally can't function as a location.
You need a special word for it.
You need specific locative nouns, like sam, beside, or ane, inside. These words always function as a location in their basic or long forms.
But the exceptions here are the most interesting because they point right back to our core idea, this deep history of settlement.
Yes. Certain ordinary nouns that frequently become place names, like Khotan for village and Mosir for land or country, are the exceptions. They can sometimes function as a location without the usual markers.
And what does that tell us?
Well, this subtle grammatical shift suggests that through repeated use as stable conceptual place names, they actually started to take on the grammatical characteristics of locative nouns. It reflects their high cultural and geographic importance. It's like the land itself is changing the grammar.
Before we move on, we have to cover plurals. We know Ainu doesn't pluralize nouns in the way English does, so how does the verb carry that burden?
The verb carries the entire burden of number. The singular versus plural distinction is expressed mainly through verbal stem alternations, and this distinction is obligatory. It has to reflect the participant number, so the number of the subject or the agent.
So the way you say go is literally a different word if one person is going versus if three people are going.
Precisely. We see three main types of this alternation. The most dramatic one, type A, is called suppletion, where the stems are completely different.
A totally different word.
A totally different word. It's rare, and it's limited to really high-frequency verbs. For instance, the verb for exist has one stem for a singular subject and a completely different one for a plural subject. This kind of difference is often a sign of a very, very ancient linguistic structure.
And the more common way is through adding a suffix.
That's type C, where a suffix like tipa gets added to show the plural participant. So you might have nasa for singular split versus naspa for plural split. And critically, these plural markers can sometimes also express event number. So like a repetition of the action or a prolonged action. But their primary job, their main function, remains participant number agreement. This focus on the agent's number within the verb is another clear hallmark of its polysynthetic head-marking identity.
So what we've established here is an incredibly complex, stable, and deeply structured language system. I mean, a linguistic architecture that must have taken millennia to develop. If this language was really the original heartbeat of Honshu, as we suggested in the opening, it must have left indelible traces across the whole archipelago.
And this is where we turn to the hard evidence of linguistic history. When a robust language system like Ainu is pushed out by another language group, in this case, the expansion of the early Japonic speakers, it leaves traces. It leaves them in the land, in its poetry, and in its historical documents.
The narrative we're really pushing back on is this idea that the Ainu just sort of suddenly appeared in the north. If the Ainu people, or their ancestors, the emishi, were driven north from central Honshu, we should be able to find Ainu influence embedded deep within the Japonic linguistic system, especially in toponymy, the names of places.
That's exactly what historical linguistics suggests. We can analyze the earliest Japonic texts, like the Manushu, that ancient poetry collection, which was composed centuries and centuries ago.
Okay, so let's look at those place names, like Noto that we mentioned in the opening, Noto Peninsula, Mount Fuji. Are these Ainu origins widely accepted?
They're very strongly supported in Ainu linguistics, though, as you'd expect with any historical etymology, they're not without some debate. Some scholars will try to force an Old Japanese reading, but often the Ainu etymology provides a much more coherent explanation for the landscape itself.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so the place name Akina, which is found in the Manushu, appears to derive directly from the Ainu phrase Eikina.
And Eikina means?
It means arrowgrass.
So the name is just describing the location in a language that was later suppressed.
Exactly. And we see it again and again. The name Kimbi is suggested to come from the Ainu word Kimpe, which means bear, and that itself breaks down to mountain thing, Kimpe.
And Mount Fuji?
The ultimate symbol of the nation. It's linguistically a ghost in Japanese. There's no clear root. But in Ainu, Fuji refers to the female deity of fire. The Ainu explanation, where the mountain is literally named after a spiritual entity, provides this really strong cultural context that the Japonic explanation just doesn't have.
This evidence of a linguistic substratum, this language layer that existed underneath the current dominant language, it's incredibly compelling because it seems to prove a widespread Ainu presence in central and eastern Honshu.
And the depth of that contact is proven not just in place names, but in literature. We mentioned that enigmatic poem in the Aizamonogatari, which is, a canonical text of Japanese literature from the Heian period.
And to find an Ainu line embedded in a classical text like that, that suggests a level of bilingualism that really challenges the neat historical separation of the two groups.
It absolutely does. The specific line, Kituni wa menete, has long defied any standard Old Japanese interpretation. But linguists who propose an Ainu root suggest it translates as, I hate the rooster, it made him awake. The structural and the phonetic fit with Ainu is strong enough to argue that the poet was probably operating in a bilingual environment, maybe incorporating an Eastern dialect phrase that was rooted in Ainu.
And there was more Ainu influence in that poem, right? Not just that one line?
Yes. The word kuta, or kuda, used in the poem is also theorized to be an Ainu word for village or house. And when you realize that this section of the Izi-Monogatari already uses known Eastern Old Japanese dialectal features, well, incorporating an Ainu phrase pushes the source of that language right back to the Jomon Emishi population that occupied that region before the hindcourt's influence spread.
That's such powerful evidence for linguistic continuity. It's connecting the Ainu people to the very foundation of the archipelago's identity. But if the Ainu language is that ancient, we should also be able to track its internal evolution over the centuries.
We can. And we can do that thanks to some very early records from the 17th and 18th centuries, documents like the Matsumai no Kotoba and a Jesuit record from 1625. These are invaluable linguistic snapshots.
And what do these early documents show us about phonetic changes?
They offer really crucial data that suggests phonetic developments within the Ainu dialects themselves. For example, they suggest that long vowels might have existed in earlier Ainu dialects, like reera for the modern rera, which means wind.
Okay, so they had long vowels, which were then lost. Why does that matter for our overall thesis?
Because it tells us that these vowel lengths were likely secondary phonetic developments that happened in the north. They weren't deep ancient properties of some Proto-Ainu language.
I see. So the language we study today in Hokkaido isn't a perfectly preserved relic.
Not at all. It's undergone its own specific changes, which demonstrates that the dialects were dynamic even when they were in relative isolation. The language was evolving, and that confirms its long history of survival.
We also see clear semantic drift in these texts, right? The meanings of words change.
Yes. That Jesuit record from 1625 noted that okay, or okay, meant young man, boy. This meaning is also found in 18th century records. But in modern Hokkaido Ainu, okay primarily means adult man.
So there's a measurable shift.
A measurable semantic change over the past 4 centuries. It could reflect societal or demographic shifts within the Ainu communities, maybe regarding the age of maturity, or it could just be linguistic pressure. But these documents give us a time-lapse view of the language adapting.
Okay, so we have the history of interaction in Honshu, we have the linguistic evolution tracked through old documents. Now let's look at dialectology. The huge geographical spread. From the Kurils all the way to Honshu, that must have created some fascinating internal differences.
Indeed. The Ainu-speaking world spanned across Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and all the way down to the Kuril Islands, like Shumshu Island. And records of Kuril Ainu show features like the prothetic 8 sound. That's the spontaneous appearance of an H at the beginning of a word. This suggests shared dialectal features extending across the geographical extremities. I mean, that massive coverage implies a very, very long history of settlement.
And even just within Hokkaido, there's that key dialectological feature that creates a stark internal divide. The difference between pa and sia as plural markers.
This is a textbook example of what we call complementary distribution in dialectology, and it is highly significant. We see 2 distinct markers expressing plurality, or large numbers of subjects or objects.
Okay, what are they?
You have the plural suffix pa-tu, which is concentrated in Western Hokkaido dialects, Soru, Chitos, Ishikari. Then you have the clitic si, which is found mainly in Eastern dialects like Shizunai and Shiranuka.
And complementary distribution means they don't overlap geographically.
Exactly. They exist in different, very well-defined regions.
And why is that non-overlap so important?
It proves that the division and the independent development of these linguistic features happened over a very long period of time. If the Ainu had only recently settled Hokkaido, we'd expect to see a blended or a confused usage pattern. But instead, this clear demarcation, it confirms centuries of internal divergence and geographic stability within the Northern Territory. It just reinforces the narrative of a widespread, established ancient people.
So if we connect this all back, the language is structurally robust and ancient, that's section 1. It was geographically pervasive across the entire archipelago, that's section 2 with the place names. And it was internally diverse and stable enough in the north to show these deep dialectal splits. To have survived that long and left such powerful linguistic ghosts in Japonic, Ainu must be an exceptionally structured and stable machine. I think it's time to look under the hood at its most technical features, the complex rules that govern its verbs.
Right, now we move into the highly structured world of Ainu morpho-syntax. The rules governing word structure and sentence formation. This is where the polysynthesis we discussed earlier really, really shines, particularly through something called noun incorporation.
Noun incorporation, or NI, that's where a noun stem gets compounded directly into the verb, creating those complex word clauses. And this is frequent in Ainu, especially with the object.
Yes. Object incorporation is very common and highly productive. However, subject incorporation is extremely restricted. It appears in less than 2% of transitive verbs and under 7% of intransitive verbs in the corpora that have been analyzed.
And that restriction tells us something profound about how the language prioritizes clarity.
It does.
So why is subject incorporation so rare? I mean, if you can incorporate an object, why not a subject? It seems logical.
It does seem logical, but it runs into this major linguistic roadblock. We can call it the ambiguity problem.
Ambiguity. Okay, explain that.
Well, if you incorporate the subject noun into the verb, it creates an ambiguity where it can easily be mistaken for an incorporated object, especially in transitive sentences. The grammatical role, agent or patient, it becomes unclear. It undermines the entire meaning of the sentence.
Oh, I see. So you wouldn't know who is doing what to whom. The whole thing gets completely muddled.
Precisely. So the language avoids structures that lead to that kind of confusion.
But is that restriction purely grammatical, or is there a semantic component, something about the meaning involved?
And that is the key finding in IU&I research. The restriction is not primarily based on grammatical unaccusativity, whether the verb naturally takes an object or not, but on the low degree of agentivity of the incorporated noun.
Can you elaborate on that concept? Low agentivity.
Agentivity refers to the active, conscious initiation of an action. If the subject is highly agentive, a person consciously performing an action like killing or creating or telling, subject NI, is almost entirely blocked. But if the subject has low agentivity, say an inanimate force or something acting passively like water flowing or fire burning, then incorporation becomes marginally possible because the risk of confusing it with a direct object is much lower.
So if I were to say, the chief built the boat, the noun chief has very high agentivity, which makes incorporation impossible. But if I said, the floodwaters overflowed the banks, the noun floodwaters has lower agentivity and might theoretically be incorporated.
That's a great way to frame it. The constraint is semantic and it's negative. NI is characterized by what it avoids, high agentivity, rather than being strictly defined by positive grammatical rules. It just shows the language has this robust system for maintaining semantic clarity.
Okay, let's move to how Ainu manipulates the number of arguments. Its valency using all these complex affixes. Let's start with applicatives, which add arguments.
Applicatives are prefixes, mainly ko and e, and their function is to increase valency. They take an argument that would normally need a prepositional phrase, like a beneficiary, an instrument, or a location, and they promote it to a direct object. It makes the sentence grammatically tighter.
So, for example, instead of saying, I speak about the village, you could use an applicative to change the verb to something like, I village speak, where the village is now treated as a direct object.
Exactly. And the difference between ko and e often comes down to semantic nuance. Ko frequently marks inanimate locatives or instruments, while e often marks animate beneficiaries. This allows for this really fine-grained control over which argument is being promoted and how it relates to the action.
And conversely, you can reduce arguments using reciprocals.
Right. The reciprocal prefix you means each other. It's strictly subject-oriented, and it is always intransitivizing, so it reduces the argument count. If you have a transitive verb, adding you means the plural subject is acting mutually on itself.
So they looked at each other.
Exactly. It requires you, and it reduces the need for an object argument. But what's really interesting is that Ainu then allows you to retransitivize that reciprocal structure by adding a causative suffix, making the complex verb object-oriented again. The ability to just layer these prefixes and suffixes is the height of Ainu's polysynthesis.
We also have antipassives, which are marked by I, and these seem to reduce the focus on the agent, maybe making the sentence less aggressive or direct.
Antipassives are crucial, although they're less frequent than applicatives. The prefix I serves to demote the patient or the object, and it focuses the listener's attention on the agent and the action itself, often implying an indefinite or unspecific object.
And it only works with certain kinds of verbs.
That's right. Typologically, the verbs that accept the antipassive are highly restricted, mainly verbs of perception, cognition, ingesting, and communication.
And what kind of verbs are completely blocked from using the antipassive?
Critically, they are never derived from highly transitive verbs of creation or transformation. So verbs like make, build, or destroy. This is a feature often seen in non-ergative languages, and it just reinforces the semantic criteria that govern Ainu's grammatical machinery.
And the antipassive marker I has a fascinating secondary function related to possession, doesn't it?
Yes, and this really demonstrates the versatility of these affixes. If you incorporate an obligatorily possessed noun, a body part, for instance, as an object into the verb, the antipassive I can step in to function as an unspecified possessor.
So instead of saying, I scratched his hand,
you can incorporate the noun for hand and use I to mean I scratched someone's hand, making the possessor indefinite.
That's incredibly elegant. One small prefix handles both the reduction of agency focus and identifying an unspecified possessor, just depending on the context.
And that leads us to the structure that is a true anomaly for linguists.
Yeah.
The indefinite causative.
Right, the causative suffix, yars. Now, typically, this would increase valency by adding the causi, the person who is made to do the action. But in Ainu, the suffix does not increase valency. How does that work?
The causi, so the person who is commanded or influenced, is only implied. It's not explicitly encoded on the verb or through a separate noun phrase. For example, if the simple verb means to run, the indefinite causative might mean cause to run, but the grammatical structure doesn't demand you specify who caused it or who ran. The primary subject remains the causer, and the sentence remains structurally stable.
So the language is doing a lot of work that is completely invisible in the surface grammar. Why would a language develop a structure like that?
One of the most significant reasons is pragmatics and politeness. This structure allows the speaker to convey that an action was caused without having to mention the causee directly. It's a social mechanism.
So if a guest broke a vase,
you could say, the vase was caused to break, without ever naming the guest. It diffuses responsibility and it maintains social harmony. It showcases a structural feature that's really optimized for social maneuvering.
That brings us to our final point in this section then, which is Ainu's reliance on context. If the grammar allows for such complex omission, the language must rely heavily on inferred information.
Like Japanese and many other languages in the region, Ainu relies profoundly on speech context. The social relationship between speakers, their shared history, information that is just in the air, the grammatical features we've discussed, the indefinite causative, the antipassive, I-marking indefinite possessors, they all contribute to this reliance on inference.
So it sounds like the difficult part of speaking Ainu isn't just memorizing the morphology, but knowing precisely how much you are allowed to omit and how much the listener is expected to infer.
Exactly. The sophistication of Ainu communication is often found in what is left unsaid. It's this intricate dance of structure and social context, all supported by that stable, ancient linguistic foundation. Now let's see how that foundation manifests in the ultimate cultural repository, Ainu oral literature.
Right. Ainu culture is fundamentally an oral tradition, so its literature must provide immense linguistic and cultural data. We can categorize it into two primary styles, right? The metrical or melodic genres and the prosaic genre.
That's right. The metrical genres are the famous epic songs. These include the yukar, which are heroic epics featuring human protagonists, and the kamu-yukar, the divine epics where gods or spirits, often disguised as animals, are the protagonists. The prosaic genre is the iu-itak, or prosaic folktales.
Let's focus on the epics, the yukar, for a moment. There's a persistent linguistic debate about the narrative voice, specifically the use of these protagonist markers.
This is a major challenge for analysis, yeah. In the yukar, the protagonist is often referred to using markers like ON or N, and these markers are polyfunctional. They can indicate the indefinite, or in other contexts, they can be the first-person plural exclusive marker.
Meaning we, but not you.
Correct.
So if these markers are interpreted as first person in this context, what are the implications for the genre?
It would mean that the yukar and kamu-yukar are essentially genuine first-person literature, which is highly unusual globally in folklore. It means the protagonist is telling their own story, either directly or through a very highly structured convention.
Wow.
It creates this compelling intimacy and immediacy, suggesting the narrator is acting as a kind of mouthpiece for the hero or the god. Linguists are still actively debating whether the markers function strictly as first-person singular narrative tools here, or if they represent a more generalized protagonist marker that's distinct from everyday speech.
Okay, so let's move to the iu-itak, or the prosaic tales. What are the major narrative types within this genre?
We can broadly divide them into three types, and each one reveals a different aspect of Ainu social and historical interaction. The most common are the human prose tales.
And what's the standard plot for a human prose tale?
The structure is pretty formulaic and usually optimistic. The The protagonist, often a young man or woman, faces some kind of incident, a social slight, a loss, a danger, and solves it through a combination of their own ingenuity and crucial divine help from the camus.
So a happy ending.
Typically a happy ending, yes, often involving the protagonist being rewarded with wealth or status or marriage. The ethical core is very clear. They reward good intentions, and they punish evil. And these stories are recounted as an actual event, though they're not necessarily tied to the narrator's direct lineage.
Then you have these fascinating stories that show cultural assimilation, the Japanese prose tales.
These are stories that originated with the Japanese, were transmitted to the Ainu, and were then retold in Ainu-itak. Critically, they maintain their original third-person narrative structure. In a certain town, there lived a young lord, which is a style less common in indigenous Ainu tales.
But the Ainu tradition didn't just translate them.
No, they transformed them.
How so?
They were reshaped to fit the Ainu worldview. So, for example, concepts of Japanese feudalism or social hierarchy might be reinterpreted through the lens of Ainu kinship structures or the role of the local chief, the Nispa. It just demonstrates a very flexible narrative tradition that's capable of absorbing outside material while still retaining a core Ainu interpretation.
And finally, the ancestor tales, the yukisukuma.
These are non-rhythmic third-person narratives, and they recount the misfortunes of humans. They are typically concerned with realistic, often tragic events, sickness, famine, conflicts, or significant historical events that impacted their lineage. They lack the magical elements of the yukar, or the clear moralizing structure of the human prose tales, which makes them vital records of family and community history.
It's clear that Ainu have a high literary sophistication. When they shift to that rhythmic, epic style of the yukar, the language itself changes. They adopt what's known as elegant language.
Yes, this is a specialized, high-register language that's reserved for ritual speech and poetic narratives. It's highly constrained. Its most defining characteristic is the rhythmic reliance on expressions that are organized in units of 4 or 5 syllables.
That sounds like a really demanding meter to maintain, especially over a long epic. How does the speaker achieve that without halting the performance?
They rely on highly formulaic phrases. These are set expressions that are structured specifically to meet the syllable count requirements, and they function almost like rhythmic padding that aids memory and melodic flow. This necessity increases the rhetorical complexity, so you see a lot of metaphor, couplets, and exaggeration.
Can you give us some more examples of those formulaic couplets? I want to appreciate the rhythmic parallelism.
Certainly. These couplets pair contrasting or complementary ideas to fill the rhythmic unit. So besides Hankanispa, close chief, and Tuamespa, far chief, you frequently hear things like Lu'un, mountain land, paired with Ramatilun, flatland, to define the whole landscape.
I see.
Or Chikunichise, wooden house, with Pokuntise, underground house, reference different types of dwellings. Or even Shongoro, the very edge, with Chimero, the deep center, used for describing distance or penetration. This rhythmic pairing is just doubly rooted in the performance tradition, and it's key to the elegance of the language.
And that stylistic difference is reflected grammatically too, right?
It is. In the elegant register, especially in certain dialects like Saru and Taitos, you sometimes find the personal affix and used with singular verbs. For example, ike for I am coming. In everyday speech, you'd use a plural verb stem, like archi for a plural subject. This grammatical idiosyncrasy within the elegant style is another linguistic marker of that special register.
Let's shift from the grand narratives to practical, fixed utterances in daily life. How does the culture differentiate between an incantation and a prayer?
This is a perfect illustration of linguistic function driving the form. Incantations are extremely short, fixed phrases used to achieve a specific practical effect in daily life-like chanting to clear muddy water so you can drink it.
So the clarity of the message is paramount here.
It is. Because the message has to be conveyed clearly and precisely to achieve the intended physical effect, incantations contain very few metaphorical expressions and, critically, no meaningless or magical words like abracadabra. They're utilitarian and they have to be recited exactly as taught.
And prayers are the opposite.
Prayers are significantly longer, more complex, and they're always improvised texts that are spun out according to the situation of the moment. For example, a large-scale ritual or specific prayer before entering dangerous mountains. They aren't memorized or recited like formal scripture. The content, the emotional tone, the specific expression, it differs each time the prayer is given. This dual system fixed, precise language for physical results, and improvised, flexible language for spiritual connection, it really shows the full range of Ainu linguistic utility.
So we've seen a language of immense internal structural stability that has maintained these complex, ancient oral traditions. But the modern story of Ainu is one of decline, followed by a very determined cultural and linguistic revival.
That's right. The language faced immense pressure from assimilation policies, which led to a dramatic reduction in speakers and a history of, well, friction between the Ainu community and outside researchers.
We mentioned the historical criticisms from activists like Fuji, who felt that early Ainu studies often lacked warmth toward people or had no soul. This really highlights the political importance of linguistic research being connected to the community.
This deep skepticism was rooted in the feeling that academic research often treated Ainu as a dead specimen to be analyzed, not as a living heritage to be supported. The major political shift really came with the election of Shigeru Kayano to the Diet in 1994. That gave the Ainu voice national legislative power, and it led to the Ainu Culture Promotion Act of 1997.
And Kayano's mission regarding the language was deeply practical and community-focused.
He was focused on preservation in a living form. He published collections of folktales, the Upeker, transcribed using the Japanese katakana script. His rationale was explicit. He wanted Ainu people, including himself, to be able to read their own language as a language of their own country. By using a familiar script, katakana, he made the ancestral stories immediately accessible, bypassing the specialized knowledge often required for romanization systems.
That choice of script is a powerful political statement about ownership and accessibility. But even with this renewed drive, the revival movement faces immense, almost insurmountable challenges rooted in history.
The most profound challenge is dialect loss. In many parts of Hokkaido, particularly the southern regions like Hakodate and Aramo, Japanese settlement occurred so early that the Ainu language declined rapidly before adequate records could even be made. As a result, those specific local dialects are nearly impossible to reconstruct, let alone teach.
So if your ancestor is from Aramo, you have to learn a different Ainu dialect than the one they actually spoke.
Precisely. Revival efforts have to rely on the few recorded, better preserved dialects, primarily Saru and Chitose. And this challenge is compounded by the geographic divide today. Many Ainu descendants live outside Hokkaido, particularly in the massive metropolitan area of Kanto, so Tokyo, having relocated for economic opportunities.
And for those whose ancestral roots are even further afield, like Sakhalin, the challenge is just multiplied.
Yes. The Sakhalin dialects are typologically distinct from the Hokkaido dialects. A descendant of Sakhalin Ainu living in Tokyo typically lacks any specialized materials or instructors for their ancestral tongue. They are often compelled to start by learning the more accessible Hokkaido dialects, Saru or Chitose, as a baseline, and then hope later to find resources for the difficult reconstruction of their specific ancestral language. The revival is just highly fragmented because of this resource and geographic imbalance.
This highlights a clear issue in pedagogy. If the focus is on description, is there a lack of knowledge on the how? How do you teach a highly polysynthetic oral tradition language to modern learners?
There is a recognized issue of insufficient research on teaching methodology. Most of the education is driven by highly passionate private activists or linguists whose main focus is documentation and description, not pedagogical practice. Teaching a language like Ainu, with its complex verb morphology and its reliance on inference, it requires specialized techniques that need to be developed and supported systematically.
And for any language to survive, it has to adapt to function in modern society. We can't just talk about bears and canoes. We need vocabulary for computers and cars.
That is the crucial step, the modernization of Ainu. This involves actively creating new vocabulary and expressions for contemporary concepts. Dictionaries are continually being compiled that include words invented by Ainu speakers to describe modern life. This conscious neologism is absolutely vital for survival.
I find the example of the Ainu toast particularly illustrative of this cultural need.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Traditionally, Ainu culture did not have a custom for making a toast in the Western or Japanese sense. This was a cultural gap that needed filling if the language was going to be used in modern social settings.
Right.
So to address this, the phrase iku an ro, which means literally, let's drink together, was recently created by speakers and has been widely adopted as the standard Ainu toast. It shows the practical need for cultural modernization and the community's willingness to embrace new language forms.
And finally, the most famous phrase, irun karapte, We hear this constantly now as a casual hello, which you noted is not its traditional function at all.
That's right. The polite greeting "Irankarapte" or "Inankarapte" was a formal exchange between men who were happy to see each other again, and it was often accompanied by the onkami sign of respect. A new tradition actually lacked a simple, casual greeting equivalent to the modern Japanese konnichiwa.
So how did it become so ubiquitous?
It was popularized through the revival movement. Shigeru Kayano promoted a highly accessible and poetic interpretation. Let me touch your heart gently. This beautiful popular interpretation resonated deeply with the public and the media, and it caused the phrase to spread rapidly and be widely adopted as the casual hello we know today.
Even if it wasn't strictly accurate.
Even though many linguists might quibble over the precise etymological accuracy of that translation, the power of a positive cultural message trumped strict linguistic precision, and it successfully cemented the phrase in the modern Ainu vocabulary. To truly grasp the Ainu language is to witness a profound narrative of cultural survival, encoded in its syllables and structure. We have traced the distinct features of this tongue, its head-marking complexity, its detailed systems for describing possession and action, and its sophisticated oral tradition, all while realizing that its historical footprint may stretch far beyond the commonly accepted northern borders. We've seen how place names across Honshu are linguistic ghosts of the ancient Jomon identity, an identity fractured by historical events like the 12th century conflicts that pushed the emishi from the Hitakami kingdom north into Hokkaido. The persistence of Ainu's sound in ancient Japonic texts, the careful work to document its subtle dialectal shifts, and the recent efforts to adapt it for a modern world demonstrate that Ainu is not just a language of the past, but an active, dynamic lineage of knowledge. The study of Ainu, from its phonology to its political revival, reveals that the history of the Japanese archipelago is a story layered deep with shared ancestry and divergent paths, constantly demanding that we re-examine who the original heartbeat truly was.
That deep dive into the language mechanics really brought home the idea that Ainu is so fundamentally different from Japonic, yet its historical influence, its relationship to the emishi, the people who formed the basis of that Jomon continuity, is undeniable. The stability required for a language to maintain such technical complexity over millennia, while leaving those linguistic ghosts in ancient place names and poetry, shows that the Ainu were core ancestral players in the entire cultural landscape of the archipelago. It really forces you to reconsider the very map of Japan you hold in your mind, not as a single story, but as a deep layered history where the echoes of one people can still be heard in the names of the mountains and rivers of another.